The glasses on your face right now probably cost a few dollars to make. You paid $250 for them. And the same company that manufactured them also owns the store that sold them, the lenses inside them, and possibly the insurance plan that paid for part of them. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the most complete monopoly in the history of consumer goods. And it was built deliberately, piece by piece, by an orphan from Milan who had nothing except a precise understanding of how control works. This is the story of how one man turned human vision into a $60 billion closed loop, and how a city in China that most people have never heard of is quietly taking it apart for $8 a pair. Leonardo Del Vecchio was born in Milan in 1935 into circumstances that most people would spend their entire lives recovering from emotionally. His father died before he was born. His mother could not afford to feed all her children, so she placed him in an orphanage. That is where he grew up. No money, no connections, no family name to open a single door in a country where family names open almost every door that matters. At 14, he left the orphanage and went to work in a tool and die workshop, a place where metal is cut and shaped by hand with extreme precision. He learned something in that workshop that would define everything he built afterward. He learned that the difference between a part that works and a part that fails is measured in fractions of a millimeter. And he learned that precision at that level is extraordinarily rare. Most people cannot do it. Most businesses cannot teach it, and almost nobody in the eyewear industry had it. In 1961, at 26 years old, he opened a small workshop in Agordo, a town in the Italian mountains, surrounded by farmland and almost nothing else. He was not making glasses. He was making parts, hinges, temples, nose pads, the tiny components that glasses manufacturers needed but rarely made themselves. He sold these components to the companies who assembled the finished frames, a handful of employees. Nobody outside the valley knew the place existed, but Del Vecchio had noticed something while sitting in that small mountain workshop, cutting metal parts all day. The margins on eyewear components were not normal margins, they were extraordinary. A few cents of raw metal transformed by precision manufacturing into a part that sold for many times its material cost, over and over, indefinitely, because everyone who needs glasses needs those parts, and nobody thinks to ask what they cost to make. He began climbing. First he made components, then he assembled complete frames, then he made frames under his own name. Then he stopped making other companies' brands and started acquiring them. He called the company Luxottica, and he ran it with the intensity of a man who had grown up with zero control over his own circumstances and had decided that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring that never happened again. That psychological blueprint explains everything that came next, because what came next was not building, it was swallowing. In 1990, Del Vecchio listed Luxottica on the New York Stock Exchange, not in Milan, not in Rome, in New York, because America was the largest eyewear market on earth, and the New York Stock Exchange was where serious capital lived. He said at the time that if you are going to sail, you should choose the biggest sea available. Then he went shopping. In 1995, Luxottica executed a hostile takeover of the company that owned LensCrafters, a retail optical chain that was several times Luxottica's own size at the time. The entire point of the acquisition was the retail footprint, the physical locations where ordinary people go to buy glasses. Now, Del Vecchio did not just make frames, he owned the shelves those frames sat on. In 1999, he purchased Ray-Ban from Bausch & Lomb for $640 million. At the time, Ray-Ban was in serious trouble. The frames were flimsy, the quality had deteriorated. Wayfarers were selling for $19 at gas stations. Analysts thought he had dramatically overpaid for a dying brand. He knew exactly what he was going to do with it. He pulled Ray-Ban out of the gas stations immediately. He raised the price substantially. He placed it in LensCrafters, which he owned. He placed it in Sunglass Hut, which he would acquire in 2001. He marketed it as a premium product with the full retail infrastructure of his own stores behind it. The lens did not change. The frame barely changed. The only things that changed were who owned the brand and what they decided to charge for it. By 2014, Ray-Ban was generating over 2 billion euros annually for Luxottica. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the entire Luxottica story. The product itself is largely irrelevant to the price. The price is determined by who controls the shelf, the brand, and the customer's access to alternatives. Del Vecchio understood this more completely than almost any other businessman of his generation, but the acquisition that reveals most clearly how the machine actually operates is not Ray-Ban. It is Oakley. In the early 2000s, Oakley was one of the most successful independent eyewear brands on the planet. Athletes wore it. The products were genuinely excellent, the brand was thriving, and it was selling extremely well inside Sunglass Hut, the retail chain that Luxottica owned. Then Oakley got into a pricing dispute with Luxottica. Luxottica responded by pulling every Oakley product off every Sunglass Hut shelf overnight. Oakley lost access to the single most important specialty sunglasses retailer on earth with no notice and no recourse. Its stock price dropped by a third. A genuinely healthy company with excellent products suddenly looked like it was in serious financial difficulty. Not because anything had changed about the quality of what it made, not because consumers had stopped wanting it, because one company controlled the shelf and decided to remove them from it. Then Luxottica bought Oakley. In 2007, with Oakley's stock still heavily depressed from losing its most critical retail partner, Luxottica acquired the company for approximately $2 billion at $30 per share. The founder of Oakley had built that company from nothing in a garage over decades. He watched his life's work get absorbed into the same machine he had spent years competing against, at a price that reflected the damage that machine had deliberately inflicted on his company's market value. The moment the acquisition closed, Oakley went straight back onto the Sunglass Hut shelves. The prices went up. Business resumed as normal. Except now, Luxottica owned both sides of every transaction involving Oakley products. That was not just a deal, it was a demonstration, a message sent to every other brand in the eyewear industry. Resist our pricing structure, and we will remove you from our stores. Watch your value collapse. Then we will buy you for less than you were worth before we started the fight. Nobody in the industry challenged Luxottica on pricing after Oakley. By this point, Del Vecchio had constructed two of the three walls that would eventually form the most complete enclosure in consumer goods history. He owned the brands that made people want specific frames, and he owned the stores where those frames were sold. But there was a third wall coming, and it is the one that transforms this story from an impressive monopoly into something that operates more like a closed system than a competitive market. After the Oakley acquisition, Luxottica added licensing arrangements with nearly every major fashion house that wanted its name on eyewear without the operational complexity of actually designing or manufacturing glasses. Chanel, Prada, Versace, Armani, Burberry, Ralph Lauren, Tiffany. Every arrangement followed the same structure. The fashion house provides the name, Luxottica designs the frame, manufactures it, ships it, and sells it in its own retail locations. The fashion house collects a royalty, and you pay $350 for a frame that was produced on the same manufacturing line as a frame selling for $80 two shelves away from it. The material difference between them is the name stamped on the arm. Then in 2018, Luxottica completed a merger with Essilor, the largest lens manufacturer in the world. The combined entity, EssilorLuxottica, now controlled the frames and the lenses, the brands and the factories, the retail stores and the lens technology, the entire vertical from raw materials to the moment you put on the finished product. And then there is the element that almost never appears in coverage of this company, despite being perhaps its most structurally significant asset. EyeMed Vision Care, the second largest vision insurance provider in the United States, tens of millions of members. Consider what this means in practice. You visit your eye doctor, they tell you your insurance covers frames up to a certain dollar amount at participating retailers, the company paying out that insurance benefit, the store selling you the frame, and the factory that manufactured the frame can all be the same entity operating under different names. The insurance benefit is structured in a way that steers you toward the retailer they own to purchase the product they made at the price they set. At no point in that entire journey, from eye test to frame purchase, are you operating in anything resembling a competitive market. Every step was designed by the same company. There is no equivalent structure in any other major consumer category. It would be like a single automobile company owning every car brand, every dealership, the largest auto insurer, and every parts manufacturer simultaneously. In almost any other context, this would be treated as a fundamental regulatory concern. In eyewear, most consumers go through their entire lives without knowing it exists. By the time Leonardo Del Vecchio died in 2022 at 87 years old, the orphan from Milan had become one of the wealthiest people in Italy. The machine he built was generating 26 billion euros annually, more than a fifth of a global eyewear market worth approximately $120 billion, and it would likely still be running completely unchallenged if not for something happening in a small city in eastern China that the industry spent years pretending was not a threat. Danyang is a city in Jiangsu province, approximately 2 hours west of Shanghai by high-speed rail. Its population is under 1 million. It is surrounded by farmland and light manufacturing. If you showed it to someone on a map, they would have no reason to look twice. Danyang produces more than 400 million spectacle lenses every year. Approximately half of every corrective lens manufactured anywhere on Earth comes from this one city. It also produces over 100 million frames annually. More than 1,600 eyewear companies operate within its boundaries. The workforce employed in eyewear production exceeds 50,000 people. Annual output runs to approximately $2.5 billion, with exports growing consistently year after year. Half of all the corrective lenses on the planet. From a city most people outside of China have never encountered. The story of how this happened is not a story of deliberate industrial planning. It began almost by accident. In the 1960s, during a period of significant social upheaval in China, educated workers who had built expertise in Shanghai optical factories were relocated to rural areas. Some of them arrived in Danyang. They brought with them technical knowledge about lens grinding that almost nobody else in the region possessed. Small workshops formed. The knowledge spread from worker to neighbor to family. By the 1980s, a genuine cottage industry had taken root. The early product was basic, equipment was limited, quality was inconsistent. The reputation of Chinese lenses in this period was entirely deserved. They were cheap because they were cheap. But through the 1990s and 2000s, something fundamental changed. The Danyang local government invested in industrial parks with modern infrastructure. Manufacturers reinvested their margins into precision grinding equipment and optical coating machinery that matched the performance of factories in Germany and Japan. They formed partnerships with universities producing optical engineering graduates. In 2014, a Danyang company developed China's first domestically produced lens coating machine, breaking a technology lock that had previously belonged entirely to German, Japanese, and South Korean manufacturers. The equipment that applies anti-reflective coatings, scratch-resistant treatments, and UV filters to modern lenses had been controlled by foreign manufacturers for decades. Danyang broke that control. Today, Danyang does not make cheap lenses. It makes lenses with multi-layer coatings, blue light filtering, UV protection, and optical precision specifications that match or exceed what the premium Western brands advertise as distinguishing features of their products. Independent optical testing has repeatedly shown Danyang manufactured lenses performing at specifications comparable to lenses sold under European brand names at 10 to 20 times the price. And here is the detail that ties the entire story together. Some of the same factories producing lenses for Chinese consumer brands are also producing lenses that end up inside frames sold under European and American brand names in Western optical retail chains. Different box, different logo, same lens, which means the $250 pair and the $8 pair can emerge from the same city, possibly the same industrial district, manufactured on the same precision equipment by the same workers using the same raw materials. The factory does not particularly care whose logo ends up on the finished product. It produces lenses and sells them to whoever places the order. Its margin per lens is roughly equivalent whether that lens ends up in a $300 designer frame or an $8 online order. The only variable in the price you pay is everything that happens between the factory and your face, the brand, the store, the insurance system, the markup at every layer of a distribution structure that has been operating without meaningful competition for 60 years. You are not paying the extra $242 for a better lens. You are paying it for a logo, a retail environment with flattering lighting, and a monopoly that raised its prices consistently for 6 decades because nobody built a credible alternative. Then 2 companies decided to close the distance between the Danyang factory and the consumer's face. Zenni Optical launched in 2003 around a premise so straightforward it is remarkable nobody had attempted it at scale before. Purchase lenses and frames directly from Chinese manufacturers, build a website, ship prescription glasses directly to the customer. No retail stores paying commercial rent in expensive locations, no fashion house licensing fees, no Luxottica markup accumulating at each layer of the supply chain. Prescription glasses on Zenni begin at $6.95, including lenses with anti-reflective coating. The average transaction runs just over $40. Zenni has now sold more than 50 million pairs of prescription glasses. Warby Parker approached the same problem from a different angle. One of its founders lost his glasses on a trip and went to replace them. The optical chain quoted him approximately $700 for a new pair. He stood in that store thinking about the fact that the smartphone in his pocket, a device containing a high-resolution camera, GPS navigation, a full computing system, and a communications platform had cost him less than 2 pieces of bent plastic and ground glass. In 2010, he helped launch Warby Parker, selling prescription glasses online at $95. The company grew to more than 140 retail locations and reached a multi-billion-dollar public market valuation. Neither Zenni nor Warby Parker has ended the monopoly. EssilorLuxottica still generates 26 billion euros annually and remains the dominant force in global eyewear by an enormous margin. But the trajectory of online prescription glasses sales has shifted measurably. A decade ago, the percentage of Americans purchasing prescription eyewear online was negligible. Today it is many times that figure and climbing consistently. Among younger consumers who never absorbed the cultural belief that glasses must be expensive, the shift is even more pronounced. Every pair of $8 glasses shipped from a Danyang factory to a front door somewhere in the world represents another crack in a structure that was built on the assumption that the distance between factory and consumer was too large and too complicated for any individual to navigate without an intermediary. The internet and modern shipping logistics eliminated both of those barriers simultaneously, and the monopoly, like most monopolies, was too confident in its own permanence to respond quickly enough. The music industry believed for years that digital distribution was a temporary problem that could be managed. The taxi industry believed ride-hailing apps would remain a niche service for technology enthusiasts. Traditional book retail believed that online purchasing would always be secondary to the in-store experience. In each case, the incumbent held an enormous structural advantage right up until the moment the disruption stopped being marginal. Then it did not stop. EssilorLuxottica is not at that point yet. The machine Del Vecchio built is still extraordinarily powerful. The brand loyalty embedded in decades of marketing is real. The retail infrastructure is real. The insurance relationships are real, but the trajectory is visible to anyone willing to look at it clearly. A structure that depended on consumers having no viable alternative is meeting a moment where viable alternatives are delivered to the front door for $8. The orphan from Milan built something that genuinely required extraordinary intelligence, patience, and strategic vision to construct. Understanding what Del Vecchio actually built is not simple. Most people who wear glasses have no idea that the brand on their frame, the store that sold them the frame, the lens inside the frame, and the insurance company that partially paid for the frame might all be connected to the same entity. That invisibility was itself a deliberate design feature of the system, but invisibility has a weakness. Once someone points at it clearly enough, it stops being invisible, and once the alternative exists and costs $8, the justification for $250 becomes very difficult to sustain. 4.5 billion people on Earth need corrective lenses. That is more than half the human population. For 60 years, a substantial portion of them paid prices set by a single company that controlled the manufacturing, the brands, the retail distribution, and increasingly the insurance infrastructure surrounding the purchase. The answer to why glasses cost so much was never the glass. It was always that one company decided they should, and built a system sophisticated enough to make that decision stick, until a city that makes half the lenses on Earth started shipping them directly to your door for $8. If this story changed the way you think about the price of something sitting on your face right now, subscribe to Dark Ledger and turn on notifications. Because every week we find the monopolies, the systems, and the decisions that shape what you pay, what you earn, and what you are allowed to know about how the world actually works. Most people never look closely enough to see the structure. We look at nothing else. The next story is already waiting, and the company at the center of it makes Luxottica look like a small family business.